Beargrass Flats, Montana Territory. Late summer, 1891. The Golden Plains looked peaceful, but the wind never stopped. Dry and relentless, it rattled loose boards and pulled moisture from a man's lips until they cracked. Old settlers knew to listen. The wind always came first, a messenger whispering the same warning every year. Something colder is coming. On the northern plains, winter wasn't a season. It was a test. Strong cabins could become frozen boxes by January, and bright fires often failed to warm the room. Out here, survival wasn't decided by courage. It was decided by design. Before the snow buries these cabins in white, join me in uncovering the raw essence of humanity standing against the wild. Where are you watching from as these words reach you today? If you have a heart for stories of grit and frontier wisdom, hit subscribe to turn the next page of history with me. Because on the frontier, winter never arrives with snow first. It arrives with a verdict. By early autumn, the settlers of Beargrass Flats were already preparing for the same battle they faced every year. Cabin walls were sealed with mud and moss. Gaps between the logs were packed tight by hand. Axes rose and fell across the valley as men hurried to split firewood before the ground froze solid. Every homestead followed the same quiet rule. Build strong walls, stack more wood, pray it will be enough. But on the far edge of the settlement, one man was not building up. He was digging down. Brenner Cruz, a quiet homesteader who had arrived 2 years earlier with little more than a wagon and a set of stone tools, spent his days cutting into the earth itself. Instead of raising walls toward the sky, he carved a massive rectangle into the prairie soil. Day after day, the pit grew deeper, 30 feet long, nearly 20 feet wide, more than 5 feet below the grass line. From a distance, it looked less like the start of a house and more like a wound in the land. Riders slowed their horses when they passed it. Wagons creaked to a halt so drivers could stare down into the growing hole. Most of them said nothing, but one man finally shook his head and muttered the thought everyone else was already thinking. He's not building a house. He's burying himself. Word about the hole in the prairie spread quickly across Beargrass Flats, and sooner or later, it reached the one man whose opinion about buildings carried more weight than anyone else's. Silas Dern. For nearly 15 years, Silas had worked across the Montana Territory as a stove and chimney mason. He built the fireplaces that kept cabins alive through winter. When a chimney cracked or a stovepipe failed, settlers rode miles to find him. If Silas said a structure was unsafe, people listened. One afternoon, he rode out to the edge of the settlement and dismounted beside the excavation. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stood at the rim of the pit, studying the shape of it, the stone base, the depth, the exposed soil walls. Finally, he looked down at Brenner, who was setting another block of limestone into place. "You planning to live down there?" Silas asked. Brenner nodded once. Silas stepped closer to the edge. "Earth holds moisture," he said calmly. "Moisture rots wood. Winter freezes that ground solid. When it thaws, the frost lifts whatever's sitting on it. Walls crack, floors buckle." He paused, then pointed toward the center of the pit. "And if your chimney draft goes wrong, smoke settles low. Down there, it won't drift away. It'll stay, quiet and slow." Silas brushed dust from his coat. Moisture rots it. Frost breaks it. Smoke finishes the job. Brenner listened without interrupting. Then he set his hammer down. "The wind steals heat," Brenner said simply, "but it can only take what it can touch." Silas studied him for a long second. He did not laugh. He did not argue further either. He mounted his horse again, turned back toward town, and left with one final judgment carried quietly on the wind. "You're building a fine-looking trap." By the end of that week, nearly everyone in Beargrass Flats had heard about the hole. And as often happened in frontier towns, the story grew louder once it reached the general store. Inside, the pot-bellied stove glowed red, while men leaned against flour barrels and wooden counters, trading weather guesses and splitting tobacco with pocket knives. Talk moved easily from cattle prices to the coming winter. Soon enough, the subject turned to Brenner Cruz. "He's still digging?" one man asked. "Deeper than a well, from what I hear," another answered. A few chuckles passed around the room. Then Wade Harker, a tall ranch hand, known more for quick jokes than careful thinking, tipped his hat back and grinned toward the stove. "Well," he said, "if the man wants to live underground, we ought to call the place what it is." He paused long enough for the room to lean in. Cruz's grave house. The laughter came fast and loud. Someone slapped the counter. Another man repeated the phrase, "grave house." Cruz's grave house. The name moved around the room like sparks from the stove. By evening, it had already traveled across half the settlement. A nickname on the frontier was more than a joke. It was a verdict people repeated until it hardened into fact. And that same evening, when Marta Cruz, Brenner's wife, and the quiet center of his small family stepped inside the store to collect flour and lamp oil, she heard the word for the first time. Not spoken carefully, not whispered, but laughed. The laughter in town was only one kind of pressure. A few days later, a different kind arrived at the edge of Brenner Cruz's excavation. His name was Inspector Caleb Halbrook, the territorial building inspector, responsible for recording new structures in the Beargrass settlement. Halbrook was not a builder. He was a man of ledgers, measurements, and official reports. He carried a leather notebook, a steel ruler, and the quiet authority of government ink. Halbrook walked slowly around the pit Brenner had carved into the prairie. He studied the stone foundation, the depth of the walls, the timber beams stacked nearby. Finally, he wrote something down. "This structure," Halbrook said, tapping the page, "does not appear in any construction manual recognized by the territory." Brenner waited. Halbrook closed the notebook. "That means I cannot approve it. I cannot recommend it, and I will not certify it as safe." He paused long enough for the meaning to settle. "If it fails," Halbrook continued evenly, "the responsibility belongs entirely to you." Brenner simply nodded. The inspector slid the notebook back into his coat and turned toward his horse. No argument followed. No warning was repeated. Halbrook mounted, adjusted his hat, and rode back toward town. He did not offer a handshake before leaving, and with that quiet departure, Brenner Cruz stood completely on his own. The next criticism did not come from town. It came from family. Ephraim Holt, Marta Cruz's older brother, rode out one afternoon after hearing the same nickname everyone else had begun repeating. He circled the excavation once on horseback before speaking. "You really plan to raise a house down there?" Ephraim asked. Brenner was fitting stone into the foundation trench. He did not look up. Ephraim pointed toward the pit with the handle of his riding crop. "That's not a house," he said bluntly. "That's a grave." The word hung in the dry prairie air. Ephraim turned his horse toward Marta, who stood near the wagon. "You and the children shouldn't be living in a hole like that," he said quietly. "When winter comes, that place will freeze like a cellar." Then he rode away. The sun dropped low, not long after that. Night came slowly over Beargrass Flats. The wind softened, and the prairie settled into its usual quiet. Inside their small temporary shack, a single oil lamp burned on the table. Marta sat across from Brenner in the dim light. For a long time, she said nothing. Then the words finally came. "It's hard," she admitted softly. "Everywhere I go, people laugh about that house. They laugh about us." Brenner listened. He did not explain frost lines or drainage trenches. He did not argue about stone or soil. He simply rested his hands on the table. Those hands were rough and cracked from weeks of digging. "I'm not building it to prove them wrong," he said quietly. Marta looked up. "I'm building it so the children never learn what deep winter cold feels like." The lamp flame flickered between them. Marta wiped her eyes and sat quietly for a moment. Then she nodded once. "We'll see," she said. Her voice was calm again. "Winter will decide." A few days later, Marta Cruz was hanging laundry near the edge of the property when a neighbor's boy wandered over. He stood for a moment, staring at the deep cut in the prairie where Brenner worked below the grass line. "Why does he want to live in a hole?" the boy finally asked. Marta smiled faintly. "It isn't really a hole," she said. The boy tilted his head, unconvinced. Marta set the basket down and looked toward the pit where Brenner was lifting another stone into place. "Before we came west," she explained, "Brenner worked as a cellar mason back in Europe." The boy frowned. "A cellar?" "Yes," Marta said. "Stone rooms dug into the ground, places where people stored food and beer barrels." She paused. In those cellars, the air hardly changed. Summer heat stayed outside. Winter cold stayed outside too. The boy looked again at the deep rectangle in the prairie. "So the ground keeps things warm?" "Not warm," Marta said. "Steady." She picked up the laundry basket again. "Brenner didn't invent anything new out here," she added calmly. "He just brought an old idea to a place that forgot it." The boy watched Brenner swing his hammer below the earth line. Marta followed his gaze. "He doesn't fear the cold," she said quietly. "He fears the wind." If Brenner Cruz had simply dug a hole and set wooden walls into the soil, Silas Dern's warning would have been correct. Winter ground in Montana moved. When frost sank deep into the earth, frozen soil expanded. In spring it rose again as it thawed. Cabins built too shallow often shifted with that slow movement. Foundations cracked, floors warped, chimneys split. But Brenner did not stop digging once the pit reached living depth. He went lower. Another trench was carved into the bottom of the excavation, narrow but deep, running beneath the future walls of the buried cabin. The trench cut past the frost line, down into soil that winter cold could not reach. Into that trench, Brenner lowered massive limestone blocks. Each one weighed enough that he had to lever it into place with a steel bar and a length of timber. When the stones were set, he locked them together with a mortar made from lime, wood, ash, and river sand. The result was slow work, heavy work, but the stone footing formed something stronger than a simple cabin base. It created a rigid frame anchored below the frost's reach. One afternoon, while riding past again, Silas Dern paused his horse and watched Brenner fitting another block into the trench. He did not interrupt. He only studied the depth of the stone line and the careful mortar joints between the blocks. Silas said nothing, but for the first time, the work below the prairie surface began to make a kind of quiet sense. Because Brenner was not building something winter could lift. He was building something winter could not move. Frost was only one of Silas Dern's concerns. Moisture was the other. Ground moisture was a quiet enemy on the frontier. It crept upward through soil and into wood. Floor beams resting too close to damp earth softened over time. Mold appeared. Rot followed. Silas had seen it happen more than once. So when he rode past the excavation again a few days later, he expected to see wooden floor beams laid directly across the dirt. Instead, he saw Brenner hauling wagon loads of gravel into the pit. Load after load was dumped and spread across the entire floor of the excavation until the ground disappeared beneath nearly 8 inches of loose stone. The gravel served a simple purpose. It broke the path moisture used to climb upward through soil. But Brenner did not stop there. Across the gravel bed, he set thick wooden beams, raised 14 inches above the stone surface. Planks were then fastened across the beams, forming a floor that floated above the ground rather than touching it. Air could move beneath it. Moisture could not climb into it. Silas climbed down into the pit to look closer. He crouched beside one of the beams and ran his fingers through the gravel beneath it. Dry. The wood above never touched soil. Silas stood up again and glanced across the entire frame of the floor. For the first time since he had seen the excavation begin, the stovemason had no immediate criticism ready. He only looked once more at the raised beams and the still air beneath them. Then he said nothing at all. By mid-October, the buried cabin had begun to take its true shape. Stone walls stood firm below the prairie line. The raised wooden floor stretched across the gravel bed. Timber posts waited to support the roof that would soon sit just above the grass. And then the rain came. It started as a slow gray drizzle one afternoon. By nightfall, the sky opened. Cold autumn rain poured across Beargrass Flats in steady sheets. Water ran through wagon ruts, pooled in low pastures, and turned the prairie soil into heavy mud. And every drop of that rain had only one place to go: down. By morning, several settlers rode out to see the pit Brenner had carved into the earth. They expected to find it half full of water. From the edge of the prairie grass, the excavation already looked darker than usual. Marta saw it too. She stood beside the wagon as rain continued to fall around them, watching muddy water creep down the sloped sides of the pit. The stone walls glistened. Small streams ran along the edges of the excavation. For the first time since the work began, fear reached her voice. "Brenner," she said quietly. He was already moving. With a shovel and pick, Brenner began cutting narrow trenches into the soil outside the pit's rim. The trenches circled the entire structure like a shallow moat, directing runoff away from the excavation instead of allowing it to spill inside. He worked through the afternoon. He worked through the evening. Lantern light flickered across the wet prairie while rain continued to fall. Mud clung to his boots. Water soaked through his coat. The trenches deepened inch by inch. Slowly, the streams of rainwater began to change direction. Instead of pouring down the walls, they turned and followed the new channels away from the pit. By midnight, the flow had weakened. By dawn, the floor of the buried cabin remained almost completely dry, but the fear had been real. As the rain finally slowed, Marta stood beside Brenner near the trench he had cut through the mud. "What if you're wrong?" she asked softly. Brenner wiped rainwater from his hands and looked toward the gray horizon. "If I'm wrong," he answered calmly, "we'll know it before winter arrives." When the autumn rains finally passed, Brenner crews returned to work with steady patience. The buried cabin rose slowly from the pit, but not in the way most frontier homes did. Instead of raising tall log walls above the prairie, Brenner kept the structure low. The wooden walls climbed only 3.5 feet above the grass line before stopping. From a distance, the shape of the house barely broke the horizon. Across the top of those walls, he laid a lattice of young willow branches, woven tightly together like a basket. Over that lattice came thick layers of clay-packed soil. Then came the final layer, living prairie grass. Brenner cut the sod in wide, square blocks and laid them across the roof, with the roots still tangled in the soil beneath them. Within days, the grass settled and continued growing, just as it had before it was moved. The roof became part of the prairie itself. From the road, the buried cabin no longer looked like a building. It looked like a low mound in the grass. Hank and Ruth Cruz, the couple's 2 children, climbed the gentle slope of the roof one afternoon and stood on top of it, looking out across the open plains. Silas Dern happened to ride past that same afternoon. He slowed his horse and studied the strange shape, nearly hidden in the earth. The wind moved across the prairie, exactly as it always had. It simply passed over the mound and kept going. Brenner was not raising a house to fight the land. He was hiding his family inside it. December arrived quietly on Beargrass Flats. The first real cold did not come with a storm. It came with still air and long nights that drained heat from the ground. Across the settlement, the effects showed quickly. Water buckets near cabin doors formed thin skins of ice before sunrise. Frost crept along the inside edges of window frames. Floors near the walls felt cold enough that many settlers kept their boots on indoors. Fires burned constantly, yet warmth seemed to disappear as quickly as it was made. Inside the buried cabin, the scene looked different. A small iron stove glowed in the corner. Its fire kept low to conserve wood. The room was quiet. No wind slipped through the walls. No drafts crawled along the floor. Ruth Cruz sat cross-legged on the wooden boards, quietly carving patterns into a scrap of soft pine. Hank leaned against the stone wall, reading by the light of a lamp. Brenner said little. He only added a small piece of firewood to the stove when the coals settled. Marta moved across the room, clearing dishes from the table. Halfway across the floor, she paused. She looked down at her feet. Only then did she realize something strange. She had been standing there barefoot for several minutes, and the floor beneath her was warm enough that she had not even noticed. A few days later, something unusual happened across Beargrass Flats. The wind stopped, not weakened, stopped. The prairie stood silent beneath a low gray sky. No grass moved, no fence creaked. Even the smoke from chimneys rose straight upward without drifting. Old settlers recognized the sign immediately. This was how the worst storms began. The land took a breath before it screamed. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply. Clouds thickened across the northern horizon. Then the first snow arrived. The wind had returned. Harder, colder. The blizzard had begun. On the far side of the settlement, Silas Dern stood beside the woodpile behind his cabin. He studied the stacked cords of firewood with quiet calculation, not as fuel, as time. Because once the storm started, the frontier followed a simple rule. Two different ideas about winter were about to be tested, and the court of the plains had officially opened. By nightfall, the blizzard had fully taken hold of Beargrass Flats. Wind tore across the prairie in long, violent bursts. Snow no longer fell from the sky. It moved sideways, racing through the darkness like white sand driven by a storm tide. Cabins across the settlement lit their stoves early. Inside Silas Dern's house, the fire was already roaring. Silas fed thick logs into the iron stove until the metal glowed faintly red. Flames climbed high inside the firebox. Heat rolled into the room, and yet the warmth refused to stay. Wind slipped through the seams of the log walls in thin, whistling drafts. The stove pulled air toward it, and the chimney carried both smoke and heat upward into the storm. The fire burned harder. The room stayed cold. Near the far corner of the cabin, frost had already begun to creep across the wooden floorboards. A basin of wash water sitting near the wall formed a thin layer of ice along its surface. Silas stared at the flames through the open stove door. More wood, more fire. Still not enough. Across the settlement, the buried cabin sat low beneath its living roof of prairie sod. Snow raced over the grass above it. Inside, the sound of the storm was muted. The wind pressed across the roof and moved on, unable to reach the rooms beneath the earth. The iron stove in Brenner Cruce's home burned quietly. Not roaring, not straining, just steady. Ruth sat on the floor again with her carving knife. Hank leaned back against the stone wall, turning the pages of a worn book. Marta moved about the room calmly, adjusting a kettle over the small stove. No draft touched the floorboards. No whistle crept through the walls. The air in the room simply stayed where it was. Outside, the wind screamed across the prairie. Inside Silas Dern's cabin, the fire grew hotter, and the room remained stubbornly cold. He slammed the stove door shut and muttered under his breath. "The fire's bigger," he said, shaking his head. He stared at the stove again, confused by what his own senses were telling him. Yet somehow, Silas looked toward the frozen corner of the room. It's colder. By the second day, the storm had not weakened. If anything, it had grown worse. Wind struck the settlement in heavy bursts that rattled shutters and forced snow through every seam that was not perfectly sealed. Drifts climbed halfway up cabin walls. Paths between homes vanished beneath white hills of packed powder. Inside Silas Dern's cabin, the stove had been burning almost without pause for 30 hours. The woodpile outside had already shrunk by half. Silas opened the door once that morning to bring in more logs. The wind nearly tore it from his grip. Snow blasted through the opening and scattered across the floor before he forced the door shut again. By afternoon, the pile of split wood inside the cabin had begun to run low. Silas stood beside the stove and looked around the room. There was still wood in the house, just not the kind meant for burning. He took down a narrow bench that had once belonged to his father. The legs were old pine, worn smooth from years of use. For a moment he hesitated, then the axe came down. The sound of splitting wood echoed sharply in the small room. Piece by piece, the bench disappeared into the stove. The fire roared again. The warmth did not last. By the third night, the strain on the chimney finally showed itself. The heat from the constant fire had expanded the clay lining inside the brick flue. Outside, the wind-driven cold kept the outer chimney stones frozen hard. Something had to give. A sharp crack echoed down the chimney shaft. Then the smell of smoke changed. Instead of rising upward through the flue, thin streams of gray smoke began leaking into the cabin itself. Silas stepped back from the stove. His wife coughed first, then the children. The smoke thickened quickly. Staying inside meant breathing it. Going outside meant stepping into a blizzard that could freeze exposed skin within minutes. Silas looked toward the door, then toward the chimney. The room was filling with smoke. For the first time since the storm began, his certainty about the way cabins should be built began to fracture. He turned toward his wife, his voice lower now. "I built this place the way everyone builds them." He paused. His eyes drifted toward the stove, where the flames continued to consume the last pieces of the broken bench. "I built it the way I was taught." Silas took a slow breath of smoke-heavy air. "And that way is killing us." Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault on Beargrass Flats. Inside the cabin, the truth finally settled into the room. Silas Dern had built his house correctly. Correctly for habit. Correctly for tradition. But tradition had never faced the full force of a northern plains blizzard quite like this. And now there was only one place left to go. The place everyone had laughed about, Cruce's grave house. Silas Dern did not waste time once the decision was made. He tied a long rope around his waist and looped the other end around his wife and children. On the open plains, that rope could mean the difference between reaching the next building and vanishing in white wind forever. The door opened. The blizzard slammed into them instantly. Wind tore at their coats. Snow blasted into their faces so hard it felt like handfuls of gravel. The world outside the cabin had become a shifting wall of white. Silas leaned forward and stepped into it. The buried cabin sat barely 100 yards away across the prairie. On a calm day, the walk would have taken less than a minute. Tonight, it felt endless. They moved slowly, one careful step at a time, following the rope between them like a lifeline. The wind erased their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. The settlement behind them disappeared. The prairie vanished. For several seconds at a time, Silas could see nothing at all. Then, through the blowing snow, a dark shape appeared ahead. Not a house, a mound, a low hump rising from the prairie grass, nearly buried beneath drifting snow. Cruce's grave house. Silas fought the wind for the last few yards and reached the small wooden door cut into the earth-covered wall. He pounded on it. The storm swallowed the sound. He struck the door again. A moment later it opened. Warmth did not rush out in a blast the way it did when a hot cabin door opened in winter. Instead, something stranger happened. The air inside the buried cabin simply stayed where it was. Warm, still. Snow clung to Silas's coat as he stepped inside, then slowly melted into drops of water that fell quietly onto the wooden floor. Marta Cruce stood beside the door, holding a lantern. Behind her, the room looked calm. The stove burned low in the corner. Brenner sat near the table, rising slowly as the visitors entered. The children hurried past the doorway and collapsed onto chairs near the fire. Silas remained standing. His eyes moved slowly across the room. The floor was warm. The walls held no frost. And on the far side of the room, well away from the stove, sat a tin wash basin filled with water. Silas walked toward it. He touched the surface. No ice, not even a thin skin. The water was simply water. Silas said nothing for several seconds. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a small brass thermometer he often carried while inspecting stove drafts and chimney heat. He held it in the center of the room and waited. The thin column of mercury inside the glass tube slowly climbed. 60 degrees, 65. Then it stopped. Silas leaned closer to the lantern light. 69 degrees. For a moment, no one spoke. The storm roared faintly above the roof of earth and grass. Silas turned the thermometer slightly, checking it again in the lantern light. Then he nodded once. "I measured twice," he said quietly. Across the room, Brenner Cruce did not smile. He did not argue. He did not explain the stone foundation, the gravel floor, the air trapped beneath the boards, or the earth that wrapped the house like a coat. He simply stood there, watching the storm test the world outside his door. And inside the buried cabin, the air remained still. The storm did not end that night, but the worst of it had already spoken. Silas Dern and his family stayed inside the buried cabin until morning. No one talked much. The children slept close to the stove. Marta moved quietly around the room, sharing food and blankets without ceremony. Silas did not sleep. Instead, he watched. He watched the small stove that burned only a modest fire. He watched the still air that never seemed to move across the room. He watched the walls of stone and earth that held the warmth like a quiet reservoir. He had spent years studying heat, draft, and chimney flow. But that night, he studied something different: stability. By morning, the blizzard had weakened. When the door finally opened, the prairie outside looked like another world. Snowdrifts buried fences and wagon paths. Several small sheds had collapsed under the weight of packed snow. Chimneys leaned at strange angles across the settlement. But Brenner's house looked almost unchanged. The low mound of earth and grass simply rose out of the snow like a quiet hill. The storm had not torn at it. It had passed over it. Later that afternoon, the general store filled again as settlers gathered to share news and check on one another. The pot-bellied stove glowed red at the center of the room. Boots stamped snow from the floorboards. Voices slowly returned to their usual rhythm. Before long, someone mentioned Brenner's strange house again. Wade Harker leaned against the counter, his familiar grin already forming. "Well," he began, "I suppose the folks in Cruz's grave house." "Enough!" The single word cut through the store like the snap of a dry branch. Every head turned. Silas Dern stood near the door, snow still clinging to his coat. He walked toward the stove and faced the room. "My cabin dropped to 38 degrees, he said. The room went quiet. The chimney cracked. Smoke filled the place. A few men shifted uneasily. Silas held up the small brass thermometer he had carried the night before. "I measured Brenner's house myself." He paused. 69 degrees. Someone near the back of the room frowned. Silas nodded once. Half the firewood. Half the fire. Silence spread across the store. The nickname that had once traveled through town so easily disappeared almost immediately. No one said gravehouse again. Winter had finished the argument that laughter had started. When the snow melted in spring, a few settlers rode quietly out to Brenner Cruz's land. They did not arrive with jokes. They arrived with measuring cords, shovels, and quiet questions. Brenner never gathered a crowd to explain his ideas. He never told anyone they had been wrong. When a neighbor asked how deep the trench should be, Brenner simply drove a wooden stake into the prairie soil and stretched a cord across the ground. "Start here," he would say. One of the first men to mark out a new foundation beside his own cabin was Silas Dern. The stove mason, who had once called the buried house a trap, now stood measuring frost depth with careful attention. Because something important had been settled on Beargrass Flats, the frontier did not reward pride. It did not reward tradition for its own sake, and it certainly did not reward the loudest voice in the room. Out on the open plains, winter served as the final judge. It stripped away assumptions. It ignored arguments. It only measured results. Brenner Cruz never claimed victory. He simply continued helping neighbors set their stakes and dig their trenches, because the lesson had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about understanding the land well enough that the land itself would protect you. On the northern plains, survival did not belong to the strongest house. It belonged to the house that understood the rules of winter. And in the end, the prairie had delivered its verdict. If you were living on the frontier, would you have laughed at Brenner's buried cabin too? Or would you have trusted the earth? Tell us in the comments.